Well, I want to thank you for having us. I've been studying stress-related growth and post-traumatic growth, and we'll talk about the difference between that for about 7 years now. And when I came to Fordham about six years ago, I met Lisa, and she invited me into her trauma class to talk about post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth. And since that time, Lisa and I have been in dialogue about post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth. And we come from it from two very different perspectives. I would say neither one right or wrong. So part of what we're going to do here through these slides is have a conversation about post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth from our two vantage points. So mine is significantly more cognitive, and obviously Lisa's more psychoanalytic. But I've learned a lot through talking with Lisa and being with Lisa.
And me too.
And so I think it's enriched our presentation. So I'm really glad that we're doing this together. So we're here today to talk to you about the role of spirituality and stress-related growth as a response to major life events. And we really want to highlight that we're not necessarily talking about trauma, though we are talking about trauma, but not necessarily trauma. And did you want to make that distinction?
Yeah, and I'll mention it again later on. Just to be clear, especially from my vantage point, thinking about the neurobiology and neuropsychology of trauma, we want to distinguish between bad stuff that happens to you in your life and trauma. And that's not always, distinction is not always made, even in the literature. So all trauma is stress, but not all stress is trauma. Trauma is something that threatens a person's life, either physically or psychologically, experienced to be life-threatening. So, and we can go into more detail about that if we need to. But I just want to distinguish between bad stuff that happens to you, and that can be anything, right? A loss, a divorce, a lost job. Those things are stressors, but they're rarely trauma. Sometimes they are, but they're rarely qualified as trauma. Trauma is something that ignites and initiates a neuropsychological sequence in your brain, in your body, that is a trauma reaction because you feel that your life is threatened. Right? So it's a much more severe form of stress. It is a severe stressor that feels life-threatening. So we can unpack that a little bit more later, but I just want to say we're talking about both, because the post-traumatic growth literature was originally called post-traumatic growth, but since then people have started to distinguish a little more among different types of stressors. So now we might say stress-related growth as a more general category.
So our goal today is for you to understand and become familiar with the theory of post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth. To become aware of the current research relative to the relationship between faith, religious coping, and growth, obviously an interest of this group, and to begin to develop a framework to nurture experiences of stress-related growth if and when they arise within your clients. Okay, so we want to start with a poem by Longfellow. Some of you may know this. Nor deem the irrevocable past as wholly wasted, wholly vain, if rising on its wrecks at last to something nobler we attain. And I really like this poem, and when I was writing my dissertation I came across this poem, and I said this helps to understand what stress-related growth is, right? There's three images within this poem. The first one is the negative, right? The destruction, the darkness, right? The wreckage that exists, right? The second image that's within this poem is the light, right? The nobleness, the hope that is encapsulated in this poem. But what stress-related growth or post-traumatic growth really is talking about is the relationship between the two, right? It's the rising. It's the experience of rising. The wreckage is allowed to and should always remain negative, right? And the hope and the light is always positive. But post-traumatic growth is talking about what happens if the wreckage exists when you are rising upon it, and the experience of rising upon post-traumatic, on the wreckage, right? So that's important to remember as we talk about post-traumatic or stress-related growth. We're not saying that trauma or stress is good. We're saying what the literature says is that enduring stress or trauma sometimes allows some people to realize pieces of themselves, understanding about relationship with others, or priorities and commitments to the world that are intrinsically, psychologically good. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the approaches to stress and trauma. Did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so traditionally, the psychological literature and the psychological approach has taken a deficit model approach. It's the medical model approach, and it's really talking about negative symptomology, right? What is going wrong? So open up the DSM. Do you have these negative symptoms? If you do, you meet this criteria. The goal is to return to baseline functioning, right? To no longer have those negative symptomologies. And when they're no longer present, then consider someone to no longer need therapy, potentially, if you take a believe into the DSM. So what happens in trauma? Do you want to do this?
Yeah, I don't know how people are familiar with Janet Bowman's work. This is a kind of classic framing of what trauma feels like to someone. She talked about the fact that all of us go through life most of the time with these basic assumptions we don't even think about. We take for granted that the world is benevolent, that the world is meaningful, and that the self is worthy. Right? The world is benevolent, meaning I can walk out my door, get through my day, and horrible things are probably not going to happen to me. I can go to work, I can come home, and the world is basically a good place. Right? The world is safe, is what we have as an example here. Young people don't die. These kind of assumptions, right? You live to a ripe old age, bad things don't happen to good people. I'm basically a good person. Bad things don't happen to me. And then if we unpack this at any given moment, we can find parts of ourselves that don't think these things, that don't believe the world is benevolent, that don't believe the world is meaningful. But most of days, we do. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be getting out of bed. Right? And we certainly, when someone's deeply depressed, they may question these assumptions, right? And we have patients who question them. But most of the time, these are the assumptions we go through life with, including the world is meaningful. What I do means something. If you have a mother like mine, you know now that you shouldn't have said this. Everything happens for a reason, right? It's all good. It must mean something. These are the very assumptions that trauma breaks. When a truly traumatic event happens, those assumptions that the world is benevolent, that the world is meaningful, and that I am worthy get broken. Right? So either the world is bad and does bad things to me, nothing means anything, nothing happens for a reason, it's all random, and or I'm a bad person, and that's why bad things happen to me. So trauma is something that will shatter our basic assumptions of living that keep us going. So that's why it really, something like post-traumatic stress disorder keeps a person stuck in a continual cycle of fragmentation and brokenness, because their entire worldview has been smashed by the traumatic event.
And so what Janet Bowman says in her book, Shattered Assumptions, which probably many of you read, is that to some degree we need to hold those assumptions and to reclaim those assumptions, even though we hold them differently, right? Because we, like Lisa said, we won't get out of bed if we don't believe on some level that the world is good, that the self is worthy, that the world has meaning, right? So the work of stress and trauma, people who work in stress and trauma, is to help people rebuild those assumptions, but to hold them differently, right? We understand that trauma reactions and stress reactions are, they're natural, they're normal, and they're protective. It's a protective instinct to pull away from the psychological trauma when we're talking about trauma. There's the metaphor of the hot stove, right? So if you put your hand on a hot stove, by accident, which would be the condition which I've done many times with 3 kids, your body physically pulls away before your mind registers that your hand is in the hot stove. So you're not like, oh, my hand is in this hot stove, I think I should pull it away, right? You just instinctually pull it away. It's a protective reaction, instinct that we have. And the same happens psychologically, right? That we psychologically pull away from the trauma. The result is disengagement. But what can happen when that disengagement continues for a significant time after the trauma, that which is protective ends up alienating us from aspects of ourselves and from the world. And so that it's no longer working to help us, it's actually working against our fully being in the world. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, and I just want to make a note, and another thing maybe we should just keep in mind is that when trauma occurs very early, if you're an infant or a young child, or there's trauma at that age, or sort of accumulative experiences of trauma across childhood, the person's entire psyche will develop around the trauma. So it's different than someone who's quite stable, has a stable sense of self, and then has an adult trauma as an adult, which certainly can shatter all the assumptions. If the trauma happens cumulatively as a child, when the brain is developing, those assumptions never get formed. There is a dissociated part of the self that never thought the world was good, that never thought the self was worthy, and never thought that anything was meaningful. However, those people will cling even more desperately to those assumptions on the manifest level because they're the only thing that keeps them from completely disintegrating. Read Winnicott, Fear of Breakdown. Winnicott says the fear is of the breakdown that already happened, not the one you're going to have in therapy, but the one you had when you were 20. Right. So sometimes those assumptions are rigidly held and not flexible because they protect against experiencing a dissociated, traumatic worldview. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. So then part of the work, Basil van der Kolk, who's a traumatologist, has a beautiful and sad metaphor that people who experience trauma are as if they have lost their way in the world, right? That they're wandering around cognitively without a framework for how to experience and engage in the world. And so then the clinical work, as you all know, attempts to help a person find their way in the world again, to reconnect a person to their internal world, their thoughts and their feelings that they have disengaged from, to protect themselves psychologically, to help them re-engage with relationships in the external world. The goal of clinical work, as we would understand it, certainly from a deficit model, is to return someone to a pre-morbid level of functioning, or if they've experienced a trauma, a pre-trauma level of functioning. Now we understand from research and from our clinical experience and from living in the world, being in a relationship, that for some a return to baseline simply is not possible. We also understand that for others, a return to baseline is possible, and there's a number of factors related to that, which we don't have time to talk about right now. But we will talk about this last group, which is that for some people, something more is possible, right? There's a different level of functioning post-stress, post-trauma. And that is what is conceptualized in the research literature as stress-related growth or post-traumatic growth. It's the understanding and the attempt to conceptualize, operationalize what happens for that group of people who are experiencing something at a different level of functioning. That is intrinsically positive. So Tedeschi and Calhoun, who coined the term post-traumatic growth, two researchers from the University of North Carolina, said that defined post-traumatic growth as the positive psychological consequences of enduring stress or trauma, and that these positive psychological consequences can fall under three categories: perceptions in the self, perceptions of others, and priorities and commitments in your life. Now, there are a number of related terms that have been operationalized: stress-related growth, Crystal Park from the University of Connecticut, benefit finding, and adversarial growth, Lindley and Joseph, who are out of the UK. So what the research literature has come to understand now, there's a group of people that said, okay, we have all this literature with all these terms, let's look at the base of research literature that we have and understand what we're really studying, because we have all these terms going on. And what this group of people found, who included Crystal Parks, was that most of what we call post-traumatic growth is actually in the research literature understood as stress-related growth, right? And this, even though we're calling it post-traumatic growth, and this really goes to Lisa's point, which is that what we're studying when we do our research studies is not necessarily trauma, it is stress. But as you know, and through talking with people, we throw around that term trauma. I went to the grocery store and there's a long line. It was so traumatic, right? For some people, maybe there was something horrible that happened in a grocery store and there would be a trigger and it would be a traumatic experience. But in general, that is not a traumatic experience, right? So what we are studying is better understood as stress-related growth. That's not to say there can't be post-traumatic growth. That growth doesn't happen in trauma, but what we know, what the knowledge base that we have is really from an understanding of stress-related growth. So there's been a paradigm shift, right? So we had the deficit model, and then in the late 90s, this term positive psychology came along, right? And rather than asking the medical model question of what's going wrong, they asked the question, what's going right? We come to understand that's where all the resilience literature comes from. And we know that if you only ask questions about what's going wrong, you're only going to get answers about what's going wrong. So in order to find out what's going right, you have to ask questions about what's going right. Really, the positive psychological literature seeks to claim a sense of balance, right? It's not saying we don't work with the negative, it's saying this is not the whole picture, and if we're going to work with the whole person, we have to understand both and balance both. So an example of the difference between the two can be understood in how we conceptualize well-being. From the traditional deficit model, we understand this hedonic definition of well-being, which we operationalize as subjective well-being, right? So do I feel good? Do I have high positive affect? Do I have low depression, low anxiety? So positive psychology takes a different definition. They look at this definition of eudaimonic well-being, which comes from Aristotle's definition of what it means to be well and to be healthy and to have the full life. And he's not talking about feeling good, though that might happen. He's talking about meaning and purpose and flourishing psychologically, right? And so post-traumatic, so the positive psychologists consider doing well eudaimonic understanding of what it even means to be well. So it's not discounting feeling good, it's saying, well, that is one definition, but what we're interested in is this psychological flourishing. So that is more than baseline, right? That is not decreasing negative symptoms and feeling good and increasing your positive affect. That is experiencing something different, which has to be measured and asked differently, right?
So Winnicott said absence of symptoms may be health, but it is not life. It's kind of like that. So just because my symptoms went away doesn't mean I'm really living. So this eudaimonic approach is, what is good living mean? And you may not always feel good, but you're going to feel something, right? I mean, think of it that way. You're going to experience your life and be in your life and be present in your life. So it's more like that than just feeling good or absence of depression.
This understanding of parenting, I have 3 little boys, so anyone that's children knows parenting, you don't always feel good, but you have a lot of meaning, right? A lot of meaning in the morning. You don't always feel good. So there's a few models of, so Tedeschi and Kelvin's model of post-traumatic growth. This is Crystal Park's model of post-traumatic growth, stress-related growth. And she uses this meaning-making model of coping. And she says that in her research literature that You know, when you experience major stress or trauma, you know, affect regulation alone might not help you to feel better. Problem solving might not work because trauma isn't a problem that can necessarily be solved. So what you need is to engage in a meaning-making form of coping. So this is very cognitive, right? And this is what she says. You experience life pre-stress or trauma. Then the stress or trauma happens in your life. And what happens then is you attribute a situational meaning to the stress or trauma, right? Now you already are operating under this understanding your global meanings, right, of how you're moving through your life. You have this set of global meanings. Well, when stress and trauma happen, if there is a discrepancy between your situational meaning and your global meaning, you're going to experience distress, right? And we don't like to experience cognitive distress, right? And so we work to decrease that cognitive distress.
So here's a very simple example. Something bad happens to you, something out of the ordinary, like say a child dies. Children don't die, right? That's one of our assumptions, children don't die. So a child in your life dies. The global meaning is the world is good, bad things don't happen to good people, right? That's my global meaning. But now all of a sudden something really, really dissonant happened. So, and I try to say to myself, everything happens for a reason. There must have been a reason, but there can be no reason. Of course, you can't find a reason. So that's the dissonance that she's talking about. My global meaning is now threatened by this situational meaning that is clashing with it. Now what am I going to do? How am I going to move forward? That's the situation we're in with a major stressor or trauma.
So what you do is you engage in this meaning-making model of coping where you're searching for new meaning, either new situational meaning or new global meaning. It could be either one. But the result is that we either need to assimilate our situational meaning into our global meaning, or we need to accommodate our global meaning to account for the situational meaning. So either I am a bad person, the bad things don't happen to good people, and I am bad, that's why this happened, or sometimes bad things happen to good people and I am still good. So when you engage in this meaning-making process, which is cognitive, and then you come up with your new meaning. So the question then is the new meaning, does the new meaning help to decrease or the stress that it results between the dissonance? So is there still dissonance? If there's no longer dissonance, the new meaning works for you, and then you ask the question, well, is this new meaning growth, right? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And we're going to talk about that in a clinical example in part 2. But so this is what Crystal Park and a number of researchers are studying. The people that would say, I had this dissonance, I engaged in this meaning making, I found new meaning, and this new meaning is positively balanced, right? So please note how the stress or trauma never, well, we don't know, it could be for some people, but in this model, stress or trauma is not changed to be a positive experience, right? It's allowed to stay negative. Now how people move through it might change that, but we'll get into clinical examples.
So does that make sense? Is that clear? Mm-hmm. So you have to have a clash in order to grow. There has to be some friction. One of the outcomes of this study is that if people have no tension or no friction or no dissonance, they will tend to stay the same. The law of inertia. Look, I know this my life, right? Something isn't like going, I'm gonna just go right on doing what I'm doing because it feels very good to me. Right.
Feels good enough.
Yeah, it's good enough. That's good enough. But life happens and then you have to go through this whole thing, and we do it often without even reflecting. But when it's a really big event or a transition in your life or something happens, we may become more conscious of our need to do this and really struggle with it. Makes sense? Yeah.
All right, so that brings up the question is, who experiences growth? Who are those people that move through that system and get to yes? Because if I can't control bad things happening, they're going to happen, stress is going to exist. I want to be one of those people that gets to yes and doesn't get stuck in no or in the dissonance. So the research has looked at a number of different populations, and what it found was that it's not population-based. It's not the experience that is linked to growing, right? So there's evidence of growth In people who have physical illnesses, they've studied specifically HIV and AIDS and cancer, bereavement, physical and sexual assault, terrorist attacks, and traumatic brain injury, along with a number of other experiences. And there's evidence of people reporting, self-reporting, stress-related growth in all of those groups. So it's not based on population, right? It's something more complicated than that. So it's not about the stressful event, and we know that not all stressful events are created equal. This is Lisa's point that all trauma is stress, but not all stress is trauma. What we understand from the research literature is that stress and growth can occur. Growth can occur while you're having stress as well, right? So you can experience PTSD and you can experience growth at the same time. So the question of that helps us to understand, or question, is the growth denial if you're experiencing PTSD, or do these two experiences coexist? And the research suggests is that these two experiences coexist. So the factors are related to growth, stress. So if it's not the population, they've examined, people have examined how much stress that's involved, and what they found is this curvier linear relationship. So like Lisa said, if there's not enough stress, you're not going to engage, right? You're not going to enter the desert unless someone is pushing you, forcing you into the desert. But if you have too much stress, you're not going to engage in meaning-making coping, right? You're having a flooding experience and you're not experiencing growth. So it's right in the middle, right? And also people that, some of the people that don't experience the stress are understood to be resilient, right? So they've already, some part in their life, have made space for this flexibility in their global meanings, right? They've looked at personality factors and high E, if you know Costa McCrae's work, high E and high O. And they found that one of the factors that's really the strongest relationship is O, which measures our sense of openness to openness, and specifically the facet of openness to experience. Social support, they've looked at the way social support affects the entire system of experience growth, and they found that it's they measured tangible social support, functional social support, perceived social support, actual social support, and they found that it's actual emotional disclosure is the form of social support that's necessary. And it makes sense. Why? Because it's through the emotional disclosure that the cognitive processing, which is that model, happens, right? So sitting down with a person we care for, who cares for us, and talking about an experience that leads to post-traumatic growth. They've looked at ruminations, so the sort of chewing things over, not in our stomachs, but in our heads, right? Cognitive ruminations. And they've looked at the ones that are automatic, that just pop up, that we don't control, and then the ones and then purposeful ruminations, so they call it deliberate ruminations, where you sit down and deliberately consider the traumatic experience and growing from it and the meaning that's associated with it. And they found that automatic ruminations, if people experience automatic ruminations directly after the stress or trauma, that's linked. You're more likely to lead. That's more likely to lead to deliberate ruminations later, 6 months, sometime after, and that's more likely to be linked to growth. But if you try to deliberately ruminate, like right after the stress or trauma, that's actually linked to a higher PTSD, right? And anyone that is following the literature on psychological debriefing, we don't psychologically debrief people anymore because we understand that might be a re-traumatizing experience. There was a research study, actually I think it was in a bereavement book I read, about people that they did this study on debriefing people after motor vehicle accidents in hospitals, and the people that were debriefed fared worse 3 months, 6 months, a year later. So purposely trying to deliberate is not associated. It's letting your body and your mind automatically deliberate as needed.
Well, you might want to think of it this way, right? You have to let the person have their defenses.
Yeah.
You have to let denial set in. You have people that need it. If you need it, you need it. So if somebody comes along and says, we don't want you to have any denial about what happened to you, you're taking away the natural protective mechanism of the psyche, which is to dissociate in the face of trauma. Dissociation is necessary, right? So your head doesn't explode. Right? die psychically. So it's just when it persists that it's really a problem. But in the immediate aftermath, that is the brain's way of surviving. So debriefing would basically rip away people's natural neuropsychological defense mechanism and really mess them up for the longer term. So we have to sit with that part of the U-shape where the person is not feeling any conflict until they are able to feel conflict. So part of what your task is in therapy, right, is to help a person grow toward being able to tolerate conflict. And at a certain, until they're ready to do that, they cannot tolerate it, and things need to be kept apart and not conflicting. You're the one who has to sort of hold them together. So forcing a person to experience conflict prematurely is really nothing but re-traumatization. Bless you. See, that's the truth. Right. Thank you for that affirmation.
Okay. Amen.
So, an important question to ask is growth really growth, or is this denial, right? This is one of Lisa's favorite questions.
Yes.
And I remember when I first started studying this, my mother, who had a conversation with her about my dissertation, and she has a PhD in philosophy and studied Aristotle, and she said, well, you know, Mary Beth, make sure you present the contrarian view. You have to consider that this is all wrong. And I was like, no, I don't. Lisa, and I was like, you're right. I know, but I'm so glad I did, because there is literature out there, there's research literature out there, people are asking those questions, and you do have to ask those questions, so I'm not just in a complete...
No more bubble.
Yeah, no more bubble.
Anymore, yeah.
You know, are people cognitively avoiding the processing of painful traumatic events? Is growth simply a return to a baseline level of functioning that accurately claimed as positive but inaccurately believed to be new? So that's, you know, do we actually drop and forget that we ever even existed up here, so we experience this sense of newness, but we really are just returning to where we were? And that's part of the, you know, concerns of the literature, is that this is, and of quantitative research, is that this is self-report. You know, we do have longitudinal studies, right? We have observer reports to corroborate with this. We look at the relationship between desire, what's the word? Oh, it's out of my mind.
I don't know.
The one that we, could you jump in my mind? This like need to like answer things in a way that people, I feel like I'm playing bingo or something.
Bias?
Yeah, confirmation bias. It's something similar to that. I can get to it. I'll find it. But what we found, you know, obviously we can't give people, the gold star is this randomized control trial, right? And we can't ethically give someone a trauma to see if certain people grow, right? So we can only study, that's like just a reality of trauma literature, right? So we have ways of seeing, you know, how this works and following people longitudinally. And there is research to suggest that some people are, it is a form of denial. And that for some people this experience is there's this growth, this is a true growth experience. And the strongest studies look at partners or other people in their life that corroborate the evidence, right? Saying, I've seen this this behavioral evidence, right? In this person. But it's really important to remember, to think about, and we're going to actually talk about that in our piece coming up in a little bit, the clinical, the experiential piece. So important points. Trauma is always intrinsically negative. It's enduring the trauma that leads to growth. Growth isn't the absence of pain. The growth in PTSD can and do coexist. And not everyone experiences growth, and we have to remember that. And that timing seems to be key for the person. All right. We are obviously put too many slides together, so we're going to move through this a little quickly. Do you want to?
Yeah, so maybe we'll sort of, we'll move through the slides very quickly, but we
Yeah.
want to talk about what is the role and what are the sort of manifestations in a life of faith or spiritual life or religious life of a person who has experienced a trauma or severe stress, and how does that contribute to, or not, post-traumatic growth? That's what Mary Beth's dissertation is actually about. So there's this wonderful passage from Romans, right? Gets quoted all the time. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him or her, who have been called according to God's purpose. Right? This is the everything that happens for a reason theology on one hand, but also a sort of theology of ultimate goodness on the other hand. That ultimately things work toward a good. This is a worldview. It's a particular kind of worldview, and it does ground very much a Christian perspective, which is the one that both Mary Beth and I come from. So that's our bias, or what we know about the best. I'll put it that way. So in that tradition and others, there are theologies of suffering that say suffering is redemptive. Certainly in the Christian tradition, this has been a major theme for centuries. And if you grew up in a Irish Catholic household like I did, you know all about offering it up, right? Suffering is good, you're going to be like Jesus, you're in solidarity with Jesus on the cross, all of that. So many of us grew up with sort of unexamined theologies of suffering that said suffering itself is redemptive. Many of our saints, also in Hindu traditions and other traditions, looking for pain and suffering in order to be purified or grow. Judaism too. So this, we come by this for thousands and thousands of years of thinking of people trying to make sense of suffering. But that may not be the only way to think about it. There may be other ones. I think that, so people who come to us for therapy, who have suffered a trauma and are religious people, are going to come in with all kinds of religious assumptions and thoughts. And these will be somehow connected with their trauma, either in terms of sort of rationalizing, justifying, being a point of dissonance where new meaning can be made, or being used completely to encapsulate or dissociate. We'll talk specifically about how that might look. And deep faith and spiritual bypass can often look very similar. Right? Everybody familiar with the term spiritual bypassing? I'm sure in this crowd most people are. It is a term that means to use spirituality, faith, or religious framework in order to avoid or go around psychological conflict, basically, right? And so it's important to be attentive to that, and especially people who are here in this room and interested in these things, who work with people coming from a faith perspective, and also in ourselves. So everybody has more than one God. That's a very quick summary of an article that I wrote. Everyone who sort of claims to be a polytheist actually is not. If we believe, in the sense, I'm not saying theologically, but psychologically, that we all have multiple self-experiences, and particularly in the wake of trauma and fragmentation, we really hold many separate states, self-states, and operate in life as many separate self-states. Most of this comes out of the relational psychoanalytic literature. And I contend also that those different self-states have different gods, and that it's important in clinical work to recognize that there is not, especially in trauma, just one God. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Spirituality can provide comfort. It can also cause pain, especially if you think God is supposed to be good and God did something bad to you, but you can't let go of God. So this is sometimes the psychic conflict that people get in. You want to talk about?
Yeah, so Barbara Fredrickson, who's a psychologist at UNC Chapel Hill, talks about this positive and negative affect ratio, right? So we know that we can have positive affect and negative affect at the same time coexisting in ourselves, right? So we can feel joy and frustration at the same time. We're complex beings, right? So we know it's this ratio of somewhere between 3 and 11 good things for every bad thing that happens in our life, right? So Joe Chiraki, who was my mentor, no longer with us, but before he died, was talking about and discussing about this concept that, well, I wonder if that works for God too. I wonder if there's a God ratio. And it fits so well. And then I met Lisa after he died, and I said, oh, this works. You know, maybe we need a ratio of these images, these God images that are positive and negative. We can hold both. We know we can hold both, right? We know we can hold good and bad. Why would we not be able to hold positive and negative images of God as well, right? There's not research on that. This is just us
Right.
talking about, thinking about, considering the psychological model.
And let's just assume that we do actually do that. Annie Lenoff, my doctoral mentor, used to say the definition of dissociation is something you know about, but you don't know that you know about it. So your ego knows about it, but doesn't know that it knows about it. So that's kind of like the self states, right? Especially post-trauma, when these parts of ourselves that, in the best of circumstances, are quite fluid, and we can move among them, and we can relate from them, and so the self I am with my family, the self I am with my patients, the self I am with my friends and colleagues, all relate to each other, and can, my 10-year-old self and my 30-year-old self kind of get along, and they know about each other, and I can move in and out of them. But in the wake of trauma, or in the aftermath of childhood trauma, those self states are out of communication and fragmented. And they will show up in the consulting room quite completely different guises. And I'm not talking about dissociative identity disorder. I'm talking about, there's a spectrum here from normal multiplicity to complete fragmentation and dissociative identity disorder. But with trauma, you are going to see those manifestations of the fragmented selves of the patient, and you probably know about them yourself. And if for those of you who are Jungian in orientation, not unlike a very isolated complex, in the sense that the person feels taken over by one of those self states. So I'm sure if you have patients who have trauma and they act out, right, or they get in repetitive, destructive relationships, and they say, wow, who was that? Who made that decision? Who made that choice? Who went to that bar? Right, it feels like it wasn't me, or who screamed at my sister in that way, what? It feels like a completely different person. That's what we're talking about. And I would contend that each of those people has a different God, right? The person who sees the world as terrifying has a different God than the person who sees the world as safe and the self as bad, right? Maybe there's different God for those people. We'll talk a little more there.
So there's been some quantitative research on post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth in regards to religious and spiritual practices, and what the literature found in one study of HIV and AIDS caregivers, that the more religious practices you engage in, the more likelihood you were to experience post-traumatic growth. People have studied prayer. The more increased prayer is related to increased post-traumatic growth. And a researcher team has looked at the type of prayer to see if the type of prayer was related to growth. And what they found was that it didn't matter how you prayed or what you prayed, it was that you prayed, right? That you were engaging a religious or spiritual belief system that was related to more likelihood of experiencing post-traumatic growth. Researchers have looked at religious orientation. So intrinsic is defined in literature as religion for the sake of a relationship with God, where extrinsic is more religion for other factors, more social support. And they found in a group of students, so take that for what, take research experiences for that intrinsic was more related to post-traumatic growth, which makes sense. I did a study in 2010 and published in 2013 looking at all those predictors like personality, social support, all the factors that they said were related to post-traumatic growth in literature, and then also spirituality factors of faith maturity, which is a positive experience of a relationship with God, and then spiritual struggle, which is feeling abandoned or punished by God. And what my research study found was that faith maturity actually was the strongest predictor of post-traumatic growth, stronger than personality, stronger than social support. Your faith was the strongest predictor. And that spiritual struggle was a moderator of post-traumatic growth and positive affect. So the research literature says, well, if you experience growth, you're not necessarily happy, but what I found was that people actually there was a relationship if you factored in whether or not you were experiencing struggle with God. So for people who weren't experiencing struggle with God, they reached this level of positive affect, where people who were experiencing struggle, it kept them from experiencing the subjective well-being.
I wonder, should we?
Let's take a 5-minute break now,
Yeah.
and then we're move into the clinical and experiential piece. Is that good?
Yeah, and
Okay.
in that, we'll address a little bit of what Mary Beth just said, that by experience. Okay, so, now we're going to do a little sort of experiment or experience together, but I want to lead into it by saying a couple of things about what Mary Beth just ended with before the break, telling you a very brief vignette of a patient that I work with, I have worked with, and then to ask you to do some reflecting of your own on a particular question. So we ended with Mary Beth talking about the term religious coping, which, you know, as an analyst is not really my kind of vocabulary. I don't really talk about coping, and I often have said to people, you're not the one who's coping. You know, like, especially from a spiritual framework, you're sort of being coped, you know, more than you're coping. But this idea of positive and negative religious coping can be a very deceptive term. So if we assume that spiritual struggle, meaning trying to deal with a God who's judgmental, harsh, unforgiving, condemnatory, abandoning, doesn't care about you, all of those things, that these are negative God images. That's how they are characterized and often called as negative religious coping, right? Or, you know, making sense of the world by saying God punishes bad people and that's why this happened. But now my world makes sense because I must be a bad person, or God is a punisher, or God is unjust, and that's why this happened, and now my world makes sense, right? Positive God images are things like God is loving, God is kind, God is caring, God is nurturing, God takes care of the sparrows, God looks after every hair on my head, etc., etc. Those are the positive God images. So I would say that we might need to think about how the positive can be negative and the negative can be positive, especially in the wake of trauma, but in religion in general. And what I mean by that is this. What we call positive God images or positive religious coping, which is having an image of God or the divine that is benevolent, can be a tool in the service of denial or dissociation. Right, so I can have and maintain a wonderfully loving, merciful, forgiving God image, and you know these patients, you know yourself, you know these patients who have these very strong positive images of God, but they also cannot feel rage or hurt or resentment or hatred because their God, loving God, does not include those things. So we can't just look on the surface. We have to look at what kind of a positive God image is it? What kind of a negative God image is it? So sometimes a negative, what we call a negative God image, can be positive in the service of healing because that negative God image allows for rage, allows for the expression of hatred, allows for the expression of revenge fantasies, and all the things that we know that people have in the wake of trauma. And if the negative God image is one who can be hated, that is a positive, not a negative. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it can be very paradoxical. We don't want to look just on the surface of what the gods of the person are, but how they function and how they are helping the person to move through and process the trauma. And there may be phases and self-states relating to these different images of God until such point as, you know, if a person is really experiencing genuine post-traumatic growth, there's a more universal and inclusive kind of experience of God or faith or the universe that includes what we call good and what we call bad. It tends to be from Fowler, if you read religious development, much more universal type of faith. So let me just give you a quick example. I worked with someone for a number of years who had an early trauma, a very kind of early and pervasively traumatic upbringing. So the mother was extremely depressed, postpartum depression, extreme case. Did get treatment and got better, but the patient, as came out in therapy, had very early and undeveloped, unformulated experiences of the mother's rage being directed at the baby. Not physical abuse or anything, but just the emotional impact of rage, alternating with turning away, alternating with a complete abandonment. Experienced the father as being kind of ineffectual and wimpy, for lack of a better word, but also with a lot of dissociated rage. So this patient had continual dreams about men. This was after several years of 3 times a week analysis, and I'll get that. But dreams of men with guns shooting people. Shotguns, handguns, blowing things up, right? And a lot of this was sort of connecting with this dissociated sense of aggression and masculinity for him. Church and God were always about good behavior. That's really, God was taught, he was learned about God as a loving, benevolent father, but what it really meant is you have to behave well all the time. You don't talk in church, you don't visit in church. Going to church was all about your behavior. The behavior was judged, sort of evaluated at the end of every, you talk too much, you did this, you didn't do that, this is not how you behave in church. That was really kind of his religious experience. In the course of therapy, over a long period of time, many images of God came out in the therapy. Some of them came out in the transference. So some of them came out as God and some of them came out as something else. Sometimes it was me, I was the God, and the goddess. We did a lot of goddess work with this person. So sometimes God was abandoning, like the mother just left him on his own, judgmental and negative. He must be a bad kid because God, he was sort of a child, God was pointing the finger like this. God was ineffectual, like his father, couldn't really make anything happen. God was raging and destructive and burning, so he was going to burn everything down. And on the opposite side, there were these goddess images. The ice queen, he used to call me the ice queen because he thought I was above all my feelings. I was so together. This is what he, at times in therapy, right? Or he had a dream about the wise old woman who makes change at this circus. So he handed in certain kind of money, and the woman handed back jewels and gems. And she made change. At the circus. The woman who invites him to dive into an underground river, but he'll probably die. Right? So these are all kind of goddess transcendent images, but they were also tacked on to me. It's kind of weird being a goddess in therapy, but I admit a part of it. Pretty cool. Until I was the evil goddess, but even then it was kind of interesting. And then eventually this patient, he really was a remarkable treatment, but because he was a remarkable person. And eventually he started going to a church, and it was a very, what we might call New Age, sort of progressive spirituality kind of church. There was a female minister there. It was all about manifesting good things in your life and prosperity and entirely positive. And it was really wonderful for him for a time. And it looked like he really was transformed and changed. But still, what had not been incorporated from his traumatic background was the rage. So the rage couldn't go together with this very positive religion that he had. The positive religion was, we're going to release our anger and transform our anger into joy kind of thing. And there was really no place for the anger at all. It had to be over there. And in the end, through the course of the therapy, he really was able to contact the rage and the power of that, the power of his own aggression. And he ended up, believe it or not, being an Episcopalian. But what he liked about that was he felt there was room there for all of the aspects of his spirituality. And he liked the kind of biblical passages that allowed for anger and also joy in a very kind of embracing Catholic sort of spirituality, small c. Right. So what we would like you to do now is to think about one of your patients. And think about someone you've worked with who's come through a major stress or trauma or is still in it. Or can even be more than one person. And think about all the different gods you've heard about in this treatment, whether they've come through a transference communication, whether they've come through dreams, whether they've come through the person's talking about their religious or spiritual life. Think about all the different kinds of gods, things that might be called negative, things that might be called positive. And we are going to hand out these little Post-it notes to you. Maybe we can say, we'll split them up. And, yeah, it doesn't really matter. But maybe just for fun, yeah.
Do you mean trauma or stress?
I'm going to let you decide, right? Because I think in the end it's a kind of a matter of degree more than kind, if that makes sense. Just as trauma and stress are a matter of degree more than kind. So you can choose any one you want. And to put on these Post-it notes, oh, sorry, we're going to give you all the colors. We were originally thinking if you want to use the, you don't care? Okay, all right, we'll just hand it. All right, so take any. So positive, negative, whatever kinds of images have come up for you. Do we have more? I have to leave it.
We should get to the colors.
And it doesn't, well, we we're going to go. Any color is fine. Okay.
You can use more than one. So if I was conceptualizing, if you
using
have an image of
images of
God,
God,
you put it on. So if you have multiple images of God, you would need multiple.
Yeah, put one on each Post-it,
Yeah.
right? So separate Post-it for every image that comes up. That's why we're giving you that. Yeah, have colors. Tell me what the colors.
I got it.
Yes. Colors. One of the things I'm gonna just read off some of these. I'm gonna kind of walk around and read them because it's too hard to get everybody up here to look at them at the same time. Absent, cruel. God is disappointing and punitive. God is all-knowing. Disciplinarian and a rule maker. Aloof. Punishes me for my sins and wants me to suffer for growth as karma. God has chosen me as special. God who abandons and fails me. God is a violator of boundaries. The God who let my father commit suicide. Yeah. God is a just judge. God is a light. God is open. God is a user, punisher, parent. As an absent abandoner. God is infinity. God is grace, compassion. God is Aphrodite. God is judgmental. God is an anchor. God is nature and beauty. God is bad, vindictive, angry, and punishing. God is California, a wide open space where I can be myself and be free. God is overpowering, sexually aggressive, and a demon lady. God is the passive bystander in my trauma. Right? So, and this is just a tiny taste, right? A tiny taste of the kinds of images that people have, the kinds of experiences that people have of what is ultimate to them. They might not call it God, they might not have a God, but that which has power. Because if you think about trauma, trauma is always characterized by a sense of overwhelm, right? And a sense of powerlessness. So God or the universe or the transcendent as it shows up in a person's life represents that which has power. And that can either be, and it can be on a whole spectrum from the most benevolent kind of power and a cooperative power with, as we learned in seminary, right, Sarah? Like a power with or power for, or to the opposite extreme, power over and overpower. Right? And I would submit to you that in your patients who have trauma, God will show up as all of those things. All of them. So God is the perpetrator of the trauma. God made the trauma happen. God is the one who will save me from the trauma. God is the one who stood by and did nothing while the trauma happened to me. God is the one who will rescue me. God is the one who will forgive me for being traumatized. God is the one who will forgive my abuser. God was my abuser, right? So all of those will happen. And I think in terms of our therapeutic approach, if we are able to be that, to contain all of those dichotomous and conflicting relationships in the therapeutic space, this is going to help the person's faith life be an asset to their growth. To the extent that certain elements of God or self are excluded from the room, then the religious life can be an impediment to a person's post-traumatic growth because it's a convenient place to, park their denial. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right. So you see what we all have every day in our practices and people who come to us for help. So any thoughts, or we're going to kind of just open it for questions and thoughts and reflections at this point for the rest of our time.
The intrinsic extrinsic kind of duality is interesting to me. I wonder about trauma sufferers what correlations there are between trauma sufferers who conceive of God as something very external, kind of like a very separate object, who almost like a big person, who can or who withhold or bestow something good on me, versus somebody who might have a more spiritual or internalized or universalized sense of God within, for lack of a better word. And I wonder I began thinking about how those different ways of looking at God or a God thing would correlate to later, to going through not just trauma but stress, developmental stress, if that makes sense.
I would say this about that. Either way, I don't think that there is a correlation between a sense of God as within me, or a sense of God as wholly other to me, which would be the sort of Bardian Protestant God, right, as wholly other, the one who transcends me. I don't know that those are correlated one way or the other, in my experience. I don't do quantitative research, but in my experience, with sort of growth or not growth, or ability to move through in a expansive way. Because I've certainly seen, including with my patient that I told you about, a real attachment to the idea that God is within me, right? This is my spiritual life, and I've worked with a lot of people in the field too, who consider themselves deeply spiritual, but they don't believe in an external God, and they reject religion, but they have an internal sense, who are really the most egregious spiritual bypassers ever, right? And the other way around. People who use their external God to externalize all the power and none is in themselves. So I don't know, from my psychoanalytic point of view, my psychodynamic point of view, it's how is that functioning in terms of my dynamics and my ability to tolerate conflict. Because I can use my internal God, right, to completely bypass any sense of conflict and feed my narcissism, BTW, right? I can be very narcissistic sort of way, but it can be a way of coping with trauma, that if I identify myself with God, so it can be used in a narcissistic way then, rather than a universal kind of, I see God in all things, and that Ignatian sense of God pervades the universe, versus I have God within me, therefore I am God, right? Which we've all seen.
Well, my question was slightly related, because I'm curious about how this connects with the idea of spiritual bypass, like the multiplicity of God. Because spiritual bypass is new to me. So as soon as you said it, I was like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is.
Right.
So what are those? How are they the same and different?
Again, I think multiplicity as an image of self and an image of spiritual life can be in the range of absolutely sort of normal and healthy multiplicity, normal and healthy functional polytheism, as I write about it, right? The functional polytheism, no matter what your theology is. And that can be perfectly healthy, right? Because it captures all different dimensions of the experience of what transcends us and all different dimensions of ourselves. I think that attaching any kind of rigid attachment to oneself or one God is a sign that something is not well, all is not well. So when someone holds rigidly to a God who's entirely good, right, and just, and then, you know, their child dies or something, where's the justice in that? You now have to create a bad that God was just in taking the life of your child. So you can
You can't change the God, you have to change the world.
You have to get rid of the dissonance
Right.
between your global and situational meaning. You have to change one of them. So now I have to say, well, my baby died for a reason because God is always just. God has to be just. But what if God, you know, maybe I need to change my view of God. There's a really interesting book by David Blumenthal, that people know this book, Facing the Abusing God. It's controversial in Jewish circles, but it's really about calling God, naming God as the abuser in the Holocaust, or as a response to the Holocaust, and how do we have a picture of the divine that embraces everything, including the negative. So in other words, it's the rigidity that is spiritual bypass, not the image itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, right, so the spiritual bypass has to do like static versus, this is what we're talking about, kind of multiplicity and dynamic.
Yes,
And
dynamic
changing.
and open.
Yeah.
So closed and open would be a
Gotcha.
good way to think about it.
So this is
Thank
probably
you.
more of a question for Mary Beth, and I'm interested that your mother is a philosophy professor.
I am too.
Well, no, it seems that, part of the framework you're introducing around stress-related growth is really sort of a philosophical undertaking when you think about meaning-making and how do you essentially have these functional philosophical constructs around the examined life and what is the world and what is our place in it. So there's obviously sort of the psychological task, but there's the meaning-making task, which is at least cognitive and probably some other things as well. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to those priorities and commitments that people can undertake from a more philosophical place post-trauma or in a stress-related growth.
Well, I'll say this, because that's a big question that could go a lot of ways. That certainly this concept of post-traumatic growth or stress-related growth is rooted in something beyond, way before psychology ever existed, right? That it's rooted in our philosophical and spiritual and religious traditions. Every one of them that I can think of. So it is a conversation that we've been having with ourselves since we've been able to have a conversation with ourselves about what is this all about, right? There's two different forms of sort of meaning and sense making, right? Meaning as like, that is studied in the literature, like meaning as this is comprehensible, like I understand this happened to me, and then meaning as like sense making, what is the sense of all of this? Like how does this fit into this bigger picture? And to experience growth, we really need to not just understand that stress and trauma happen, but engage with this concept of how does this fit into this larger sense of this thing that we're existing in called life. I think certainly from a developmental perspective, we question what this is all about as soon as we can question, right? My 4-year-old was having an existential crisis like 2 weeks
said
ago.
that, yeah.
Like would not go to sleep because he wanted to understand who was dying and how everyone was dying and who's God this guy, we're all gonna die, and then immediately start questioning, well, what is birth? Like after an hour of like questioning death, like then we're like an hour and a half past bedtime. But it was within him, he's holding all these tensions and these questions as soon as we can verbalize, right? So this question of what is this about is something we've been engaging in well before psychology, right? So deeply rooted in life, existence.
I have two questions. One's that's piggybacking on Kelly and one that's totally related to that. But I've always loved Viktor Frankl's Man Search for Meaning.
Totally related.
And I find that I struggle more with people working with people who have no meaning, like there's no God, there's no meaning, because that leaves you with this sense that there's no purpose to life, there's no reason for anything, why should I wake up in the morning, as opposed to, I mean, I find people who at least find some kind of meaning are easier to work with, because you can kind of reflect that back and ask them questions and try to like tease it out more, get clarity in what it is, what it doesn't have to mean changes. The no meaning is, I think, sometimes tougher for me to work with clients, and I wonder if you have any suggestions on how to work with a client who can't find any meaning in suffering or
Just any meaning.
any
Well,
meaning.
I think, again, it's, for me, it wouldn't necessarily be a goal on my best days that, my patients have any kind of spiritual life at all, by my definition of what that is. I do also find it easier when they do, but I think that's more about me than about them. But I think to have no meaning, really, like nothing means anything, that's despair. And working in a realm of despair and depression, and it's very painful and very difficult. I think that's kind of different than ending up with a framework that this tragedy that happened to me means nothing. Right? Or, if I'm sexually abused as a child, that has no meaning. It wasn't planned by God. It wasn't given to me as a gift because I'm special. That was when I'm stronger than other people, or so that I would have a better life. It doesn't mean any of those things. However, it happened to me, and now I have to make meaning out of it. Right? That's sort of maybe where being able to sit with the person in the place of this doesn't mean anything. Maybe they're still they're still in the middle of that loss of their assumptions. It's supposed to mean something, and why doesn't it mean anything? I mean, the existentialists concluded, right, that life doesn't mean anything, but life is you create your meaning, and that might be okay, But I think it's just painful to sit with people when they're in that space, and I get that. It got find your own. You have to go out and find your own meaning to sustain you through those sessions.
But then with the goal of the therapist maybe to help them to make their own meaning, to find some kind of, I tend to look at help, I wrote a book, and part of the premise of the book is about looking at life as a personal growth adventure. So that's sort of like, it's not about like just being happy, it's about how are you growing, are you different than when you were, how can you develop these like emotional or mental or spiritual muscles that, like when life throws stuff at you, can you use your, adversity is like a personal trainer to help you get stronger.
Right.
That's my philosophy. But a lot of people, don't necessarily buy that or buy into it. And I find myself wanting to impart that because it's like kind of how I look at life, and yet I know that that's meaningful for some people, and also like, can I help people create meaning who don't have that, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's very painful, and I think too that approach, like, adversity as a personal trainer, and it builds up your muscles. I mean, there's a certain assumption and philosophy behind that, right, about theodicy, the meaning of suffering and evil. That's, you're framing that in a particular kind of way. And I think I spoke with somebody at the break, we talked about the sort of cultural, the privilege of having, the first world privilege of having that attitude. Because I think if, you talk to some people who come from Syria right now, they're not probably going to feel it way. So I think to put those things in context and to look at the context of your patient's life and to try as much as possible to enter into their despair. I know it sucks, but to say, I am going to take my attitude of, suffering can make you stronger, and I'm just going to put that in the closet for the next 45 minutes, and I'm going to look out at the world through this person's despair. If you can tolerate that, I think that's more meaningful to the person than any meaning you could give them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so.
But you gotta feel like you can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd just like to share with you, when I was the Veterans Coordinator and Counselor at John Jay from 2009 to 2012, this exactly was the term that helped frame how we worked with them and how I started a 3-credit course to reintegrate them back into school, to really there was boot camp to really take a young civilian and to turn him into a warrior, but the converse did not really exist. And to have them understand the concept, they couldn't even grasp what post-traumatic growth. No, you mean post-traumatic stress disorder. No, this is not pathologizing. Growth comes out of very challenging experiences. And it really was transformative for so many of these young men and women to be able to look at their experience in a whole new way that was really healthy and able to grow.
And unless we engage that piece of them, but clinically clinically we take the lead of our clients, but we
That's
can
right.
ask the questions, we can wonder with them out loud. Some people in these experiences feel like they grow.
That was not a concept that they really even came up with until they heard this. And they were able to reflect on it much differently.
Yeah. And again, I'm always bringing in, Mary Beth teases me because I'm such a pathologizer. I'm an analyst, so I always look at the pathology. I look at what's left out, what's not there, not what's there. I know what's not there. So to making sure that that growth does not leave behind dissociated pieces, because the post-traumatic growth literature only assesses self-reports. So it can't deal with the unconscious, right? So, and I kind of think the unconscious is important. That's my bias. I admit it. I'm right out there with it. So I want to just try and make it as holistic as possible. And I think if you have people that can benefit and are able to grasp onto that without it being a denial, and sort of what's the word I'm looking, enabler of denial, that's great. But just always be aware that it could be with certain people, sort of convenient parking spot. A couple of other ones. And then
I think we have time for just one more question.
we have 2 people that were waiting. Can we do 2 more?
Okay, 2 more.
I'll make it quick, kind of a little 2-part, but I did want to address your comment because I have been involved to a certain degree with the Ethical Culture Society, which is a wonderful organization. They're secular, they're humanist, and so atheists, agnostics are fully welcome, but they're very inclusive. So, and there's actually a wonderful book called Good Without God. So they have such meaning in their lives. Their philosophy is deed above creed. So they're very invested in justice, social action. So it's kind of a misconception that if you don't believe in a God or gods that in some way you don't have meaning in your life. So I think it's a real misunderstanding and a real conflict in our culture that if you're not religious or don't believe in God or the traditional God, you have no meaning in your life. So I wanted to just, make that comment. Also, there's an amazing website based on a book, and I actually have a question about it because it's the title of this website and the book is Thank God I ... And what it is, because we tend to think of gratitude as, well, thank God I have this wonderful family, thank God I live in this beautiful home. This website and the book, based on a book, is thank God I had cancer. Thank God my child died.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just Google it because it's fascinating and I have questions about it. So people who write in, it's the idea of making lemonade out of lemons. The whole idea is, thank God my child died. I now started an organization to help others whose children have died. So are they bypassing? Are they in denial? It's
You know,
it really makes me
it's a
feel
problematic
Yeah.
construction, right? Thank God I had
Yeah.
cancer. I certainly know people who said that because it woke me up to all the ways I was not living, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Thank God my child died. For me, really,
Yes.
sort of a different order of business, but
I mentored this girl whose mom had cancer and died. I mean, wonderful woman, very sad story. And she wrote her college essay, and her grandmother gave it to me like years after, you know. And the last line was, "Thank you, cancer." You know? And I think there's a difference between "Thank you, cancer" and "Thank you, God," because she feels like she felt in that essay that that she learned things from enduring
right.
the
Yes.
cancer, but she wasn't saying thanks God for taking my
Well,
mom.
one
You know,
thing I
like
should
it was more
mention, yes.
like this is sad. I miss her. It hurts. I love her. I had to grow because of this. I grew. And thank you for this growth experience.
Yes.
I still miss my mom.
I should mention that as the
Yeah.
gist of this book and website because they are very specific. They say they use God as kind of a symbol, but they say this is not religious. So people who are atheists or agnostics might say, thank God. It's they really point out this is not religious or even
Yeah, well, you can
spiritual.
say that,
So it's
right?
more coping. Yeah.
There's
I'm
a
not
lot of,
posting.
I
not
think
going
being
there.
the kind of deconstructionist, right, I would just look at the unstated assumptions around a term called thank God, and the unstated assumptions about, what's religious and what's not religious. And in our culture, I would say even if you're an atheist, you have gods because you grew up in America. If you grew up in America, you have God images that are internalized from the culture, even if they are gods that you reject. I don't believe in, there's a God I don't believe in.
Absolutely.
Right, that's Anne Maria Rizzuto.
God is in the foxholes, right? And that,
We will stay
We'll
around for
stick
5
around,
minutes with
yeah, we'll
other
stick around.
questions,
We'll
but
stick
thank
All
you.
day long.
Yeah.
Yeah.